The Phantom Legion, the art of the invisible war. The hook. In the summer of 1944, the German High Command believed they were facing a massive American armored division of 30,000 men. In reality, they were being held back by 1,100 artists, radio operators, and a collection of giant rubber balloons. This is the story of the war's greatest lie. The canvas of war. The humid air of Camp Forest, Tennessee, smelled of pine needles and industrial-grade rubber. It was 1944, and Jack Miller, a 22-year-old illustrator from the Pratt Institute, stood in the mud, staring at a miracle. "It looks real, doesn't it?" whispered Arthur, a stage magician from New York, who had been drafted into the same strange unit, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Jack walked toward the M4 Sherman tank. From 20 yards away, it was a terrifying beast of steel. But as Jack reached out and touched the hull, his finger didn't meet cold armor. It pushed into soft, pressurized fabric. He gave the tank a shove, and the 30-ton war machine wobbled like a jelly bowl. "It weighs 93 pounds, Arthur grinned, patting the air-filled nozzle hidden near the tracks. "If the Nazis see this from a reconnaissance plane, they don't see a balloon. They see the spearhead of an invasion." Jack looked around the camp. There were no career soldiers here. There were fashion designers, sound engineers from Bell Labs, architects, and painters. They were told their mission was tactical deception. They were the Ghost Army. Their job wasn't to kill the enemy. It was to convince the enemy that they were somewhere they weren't. "We're going to Europe with rubber toys and record players," Jack muttered, a cold pit forming in his stomach. "God help us if they shoot back." The sonic mirage. While Jack mastered the art of inflatable warfare, another group was working on the sonic deception. Inside a darkened tent, Colonel Hilton Riley stood before a massive wire recorder. "Play it," he commanded. An engineer flipped a switch. Suddenly, the tent exploded with the deafening roar of a motorized infantry division, the clanking of treads, the shouting of sergeants, the grinding of gears. It was indistinguishable from the real thing. "We recorded these sounds at Fort Knox. We can project this noise through 500-pound speakers mounted on half-tracks. We can make a single platoon sound like an entire corps from 15 miles away." This was the second layer of the lie. If the Germans couldn't see the tanks through the fog, they would hear them. The Ghost Army was building a symphony of ghosts.
The fields of France. June 1944. The Normandy landings had happened, but the bridgehead was fragile. The 23rd was shipped out under a veil of absolute secrecy. Jack Miller found himself in the hedgerows of France, barely a few miles from the front lines. The mission was Operation Brest. The American 6th Armored Division was moving out to a new position, leaving a massive gap in the line. If the Germans realized the gap existed, they would pour through and encircle the Allied forces. "Jack, get the compressors," his sergeant barked. "We have 4 hours before sunrise. I want 2 battalions of tanks in that field by 0400. Under the cover of darkness, the artists went to work. They unrolled the heavy rubber skins. Portable generators hummed, hissing air into the silhouettes. Slowly, the Ghost Division rose from the grass. Jack spent the night painting fake serial numbers on the rubber hulls. He even used a shovel to dig fake tread marks into the soft mud, leading from the road into the fields. Deception, he realized, was all in the details. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, a German Henschel HS-126 scout plane buzzed overhead. Jack dived into a trench, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked up through the camouflage netting. The German pilot circled once, twice. He saw the tanks. He saw the campsites Jack's team had mocked up with fake laundry lines and smoking mess kits. The plane turned and banked back toward the German lines. The bait was taken. The sound of iron. That night, the speakers began to howl. From the edge of the woods, the sonic trucks projected the sound of a massive troop movement. Jack sat in the dark, clutching his carbine, a real one, though he felt like a fraud holding it. Across the valley, they heard the German response, panic, shouted orders, the sound of heavy German artillery adjusting their aim. Boom! A shell landed 50 yards from Jack, showering his rubber tank with dirt. "They're firing at the balloons!" Arthur cheered quietly from the next foxhole. "The idiots are wasting their ammo on air!" But the laughter didn't last long. A second shell landed closer, then a third. The Germans weren't just scouting, they were preparing a counterattack. They believed a massive American force was gathered in Jack's field, and they were sending their panzers to meet it. Jack realized the terrifying flaw in their plan. To keep the lie alive, they had to stay. They had to pretend to be a division of thousands, when in reality there were only a few dozen men with no heavy weapons to defend themselves. The Rhine crossing. The story of the Ghost Army reached its climax at the Rhine River in 1945. This was Operation Viersen. The Ninth Army was preparing to cross the Rhine, a massive operation. To ensure success, the Ghost Army was ordered to draw the German 1st Paratroop Army away from the actual crossing site. Jack and his team set up over 600 inflatable tanks and trucks. They created fake headquarters, complete with actors dressed as generals walking around with fake maps. They even used spoof radio, operators who mimicked the unique fist, the typing style, of famous Allied radio operators to trick German intelligence. For 3 days, the Ghost Army put on the performance of a lifetime. They lured the German reinforcements 30 miles away from the real attack zone. When the real Ninth Army finally crossed the Rhine, they met almost no resistance. The Germans were too busy shelling a field full of rubber balloons and loudspeakers. The legacy of silence. When the war ended, Jack Miller and his fellow artists were sworn to secrecy. They couldn't tell their wives, their parents, or their friends how they saved an estimated 30,000 American lives. Their records were classified top secret for 50 years. Jack went back to New York, becoming a successful commercial artist. He never spoke of the tanks he carried on his back or the divisions he grew with an air pump. But sometimes, when he looked at a blank canvas, he didn't see a painting. He saw the fog of France, the hiss of a compressor, and the invisible army that won a war without firing a single shot.
The Masquerade of Mayhem. The success at the Rhine had changed the atmosphere within the 23rd. The men weren't just decorators anymore. They were a precision instrument of psychological warfare. But as the Allies pushed deeper into the heart of Germany, the risks intensified. The front line was no longer a neat line on a map. It was a chaotic, shifting maze of crumbling villages and desperate German holdouts. In April 1945, Jack's unit was moved to the outskirts of a town near the Elbe River. The mission was delicate. They had to impersonate the 2nd Armored Division to cover a flanking maneuver. "This time is different," Colonel Rayleigh told the men during the briefing. "We're not just sitting in a field. We're going to leak information in the local taverns. We're going to be seen." This was the most dangerous part of the Ghost Army's repertoire, the special effects. Jack and Arthur were given counterfeit patches of the 2nd Armored to sew onto their jackets. They drove into a nearby liberated village in trucks with fake bumper markings. Their job was to act like cocky, battle-hardened tankers who had just arrived with hundreds of heavy vehicles. "I feel like a spy," Arthur whispered as they sat in a small French cafe filled with suspicious locals. Keep your voice down, Jack hissed. There are eyes everywhere. If the stay-behind German agents realize we're just kids from art school, the whole flank collapses. They spent the evening talking loudly about the massive shipment of tanks arriving at midnight and the shortage of fuel for the hundreds of Shermans parked in the woods. It was a performance that would have won a Tony Award in New York. Outside, the Sonic trucks were already at work, playing the distant sound of clanking treads. The illusion was complete. The townspeople, and the German spies among them, were convinced that a juggernaut had arrived. The paper tiger's teeth. That night, disaster struck. A stray German patrol, separated from their main command, stumbled directly into the ghost camp. Usually, the ghost army was protected by a small security detail of real infantry, but tonight they were stretched thin. Jack was adjusting the air pressure on a dummy jeep when he heard the shout, "Halt!" Then, the distinctive, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of an MP-40 submachine gun. "Down! Get down!" Arthur screamed. The German patrol had emerged from the tree line, firing at what they thought was an American motor pool. They riddled a rubber tank with bullets. Jack watched in surreal horror as the 30-ton tank began to hiss and slowly deflate, its turret sagging like a melting candle. They're going to realize it's a fake, Jack realized. If the Germans saw the tank collapse into a pile of rubber, the secret of the 23rd would be out, and the entire Allied strategy would be compromised. "Arthur, the flashbangs!" Jack yelled. Among their theater supplies, they had pyrotechnics designed to mimic the muzzle flashes of heavy artillery. Jack grabbed a handful of magnesium charges. He didn't aim at the Germans. He aimed at the deflating tank. Boom! A massive explosion of white light and smoke engulfed the rubber ruins. To the Germans, it looked like they had hit the tank's fuel line or ammunition rack. "Return fire!" the sergeant yelled. The artists grabbed their rifles, the real ones they prayed they'd never use. They fired into the dark woods, not to kill, but to create a wall of sound. At the same time, the sound engineers cranked the speakers to 100%, playing the sound of 50 men screaming "Charge!" and the roar of a tank engine starting up right behind the Germans. Terrified by the sudden arrival of an armored counterattack, the German patrol retreated into the forest, convinced they had barely escaped a massive force. Jack sat in the mud, his hands shaking. He looked at the charred remains of the rubber tank. They had held the lie, but only by a thread. The ghost of the artist. As the war in Europe drew to a close, the Ghost Army followed the trail of liberation through the ruins of the Third Reich. They saw the horrors of the camps, the hollowed-out cities, and the price of the big lie the Nazis had told their own people. It was a strange contrast. The Nazis used lies to destroy. The Ghost Army used lies to save. In May 1945, the news of Germany's surrender broke. While the rest of the world celebrated with ticker-tape parades, the men of the 23rd were pulled into a quiet room. "You are going home," a general told them, "but you are going home as if this never happened. You will be discharged as regular engineers or clerks. If you speak of the inflatables, the sounds, or the deceptions, you will be prosecuted under the Espionage Act." "Why?" Jack asked. "The war is over." "The war is over," the general replied coldly. "But the next war might need these tricks, and a trick only works if the audience doesn't know how it's done." Jack Miller packed his brushes and his charcoal pencils. He left behind the rubber tanks and the giant speakers. He returned to a New York that was vibrant and loud, but to him it felt strangely quiet. 50 years of shadows. For decades, Jack lived a normal life. He married a woman named Claire, had 3 children, and became a celebrated art director for a major advertising firm. Sometimes at dinner parties, friends would talk about their heroic uncles who stormed the beaches or flew B-17s. "What did you do in the war, Jack?" they would ask. "I was an engineer," he would say with a faint smile, "mostly just camouflage and road building." He kept a small trunk in his attic. Inside were sketches he had made in the trenches, drawings of men inflating balloons in the rain, of speakers hidden in haystacks, and portraits of the ghost soldiers who had since passed away. He felt like a man living in two worlds. One world was real, and the other was a masterpiece of air and sound that evaporated the moment the war ended. Then, in 1996, the phone rang. "Mr. Miller, this is the Department of Defense. The records of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops have been declassified. There's going to be a ceremony."
The reveal. The Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. was crowded. Old men with white hair and canes stood together, looking at a peculiar sight in the center of the hall, a fully inflated M4 Sherman rubber tank. For the first time in half a century, Jack saw his canvas. Historians stood on stage revealing the staggering statistics. The 23rd had conducted over 20 large-scale deceptions. They had saved an estimated 15,000 to 30,000 lives. They had been the Phantom Legion that kept the German army guessing until it was too late. Jack stood before the rubber tank and reached out. His hand, now wrinkled with age, touched the fabric. "It still weighs 93 pounds, a voice said beside him. Jack turned. It was Arthur. They hadn't seen each other since 1945. They didn't say much. They didn't have to. They stood in silence, two old artists who had painted a victory out of thin air. The world finally knew. The greatest story of World War II wasn't written in blood and steel, but in creativity, courage, and the audacity to tell a lie so big it saved the world. The secret architects. The declassification didn't just bring Jack and Arthur back together. It revealed that the Ghost Army had been a breeding ground for some of the greatest creative minds of the 20th century. As the veterans sat in the Smithsonian shadow, they traded stories of who they had become after the Great Silence. "Did you see Bill's latest collection?" Arthur asked, gesturing to a newspaper clipping of Bill Blass, who had become a fashion icon. Jack nodded. He learned to drape fabric over rubber tanks before he draped it over models in New York. "And look at Ellsworth Kelly." He pointed to a book of abstract art. He spent the war staring at camouflage patterns and shadows. Now his paintings are in every major museum in the world. The realization was profound. The aesthetic of post-war America, its fashion, its art, its advertising, had been shaped by men who spent their youth perfecting the art of the invisible war. Their ability to manipulate perception hadn't just fooled the Nazis, it had revolutionized the way the world saw color, shape, and sound. The ghost in the machine. But not every story ended in fame. As Jack sifted through the newly released documents, he found a file marked Operation Vengeance, the Blackout. It was a mission he hadn't been part of, a localized deception that had gone tragically wrong. In the final weeks of the war, a small detachment of the Ghost Army had been sent to a village near the Czech border. Their goal was to mimic a massive Allied encirclement to force a German garrison to surrender without a fight. The file contained a series of frantic radio transcripts. 0200 hours, visuals deployed, inflatables active. 0300 hours, sonic trucks emitting heavy armor tracks. 0415 hours, enemy fire concentrated on dummy positions. 0445 hours, silence. The silence wasn't a tactical choice. A group of SS diehards, realizing the tanks weren't firing back, had charged the positions with bayonets.
When they reached the armor, they found not steel, but rubber and artists. Jack read the names of the fallen. They were boys he had shared coffee with in Tennessee. They had died holding nothing but a paintbrush and a dream of home. It was a stark reminder that while their war was a show, the stakes were deathly real. The final canvas. In his final years, Jack Miller moved to a small studio in Vermont. He no longer painted for ad agencies. He painted the ghosts. He created a series of massive canvases. At first glance, they looked like landscapes of the French countryside. But if you looked closely, if the light hit the oil paint just right, you could see the faint, translucent outline of a Sherman tank hidden in the trees. He called the collection the weight of air. One afternoon, a young history student named Sarah visited his studio. She had been researching the 23rd for her thesis. "Mr. Miller," she asked, looking at a painting of a lone soldier standing by a giant speaker, "was it worth it, living a lie for 50 years?" Jack looked out the window at the rolling green hills, so similar to the ones near the Rhine. "We didn't live a lie, Sarah," he said softly. "We created a space where the truth could survive. Every time a German shell hit one of our balloons, it was a shell that didn't hit a 20-year-old boy in the 1st Infantry Division. We traded rubber for lives. That's the most honest work I've ever done." The echoes of the 23rd. The story of the Ghost Army eventually reached the highest levels of the American government. In 2022, the unit was finally awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor the United States can bestow. By then, only a handful of the original 1,100 men were still alive, but their legacy had already integrated into modern warfare. The deception tactics they pioneered, the use of electronic signatures, fake heat patterns for satellites, and psychological operations, became the foundation of the modern U.S. Army's information warfare wings. The artists had taught the generals that the mind is a battlefield just as much as the mud. Beyond the horizon. Jack Miller passed away quietly in his sleep at the age of 101. On his bedside table was a small, hand-carved wooden tank, no bigger than a matchbox. At his funeral, a small group of military officers attended. They didn't wear medals for bravery in combat. They were from the Intelligence and Psychological Operations Commands. They stood at attention as a bugler played taps. As the notes echoed through the cemetery, a strange thing happened. A light breeze caught the large American flag draped over the casket. For a moment, the wind filled the fabric so perfectly that it stood rigid, looking as solid as stone, before softening back into the folds of the cloth. A final trick of the light, a final deception. The Ghost Army had finally marched home, disappearing into the history books, leaving behind a world that was free, partly because a group of artists had the courage to play the most dangerous game of pretend in human history.
The City Beneath the Ice, The Secret of Camp Century. The Hook. In 1959, the U.S. Army told the world they were building a scientific research station deep inside the Greenland ice sheet. They showed the public a futuristic nuclear-powered base, complete with a cinema and a chapel. But hidden beneath the snow was a much darker blueprint, a 2,500-mile tunnel network designed to hide 600 nuclear missiles aimed directly at the Soviet Union. The Frozen Frontier. Major Tommy Thompson stepped off the transport plane into a world of blinding white. The wind at North Greenland didn't just blow, it bit through the skin like 1,000 serrated knives. "Welcome to the end of the world, Major," Colonel Silas Vance barked over the roar of the gale. Tommy looked around. There was nothing but flat, featureless ice for hundreds of miles. "I was told I was here for a weather station, Colonel." Vance laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "That's what the newspapers in Copenhagen and D.C. think. We're calling this Camp Century, the city under the ice. But your job, as a structural engineer, isn't to measure snowflakes. It's to see if this glacier can hold the weight of the Third World War." The nuclear mole. The construction was a marvel of 1960s hubris. Instead of building on the ice, they built into it, using massive Swiss Peter plows, giant snow milling machines. They carved deep trenches that were then covered with steel arches and buried under feet of blown snow. Inside these tunnels, the Americans installed the PM-2A, the world's first portable nuclear reactor. It provided unlimited heat and power, allowing soldiers to live in shirt sleeves while the surface temperature dropped to -60 degrees Fahrenheit. "It's a miracle," Tommy whispered as he walked through the main corridor. There was a barber shop, a laundry, and even a small hospital. "But why the extra tunnels, Colonel? The scientific wing is only half this size." Vance led him to a restricted sector, a tunnel that stretched endlessly into the dark. "This is Project Iceworm. We're going to build 2,500 miles of these. Inside, we'll have massive railroad tracks. We'll keep 600 Minutemen missiles on those tracks, constantly moving. The Soviets will never be able to hit a moving target under 200 feet of ice." The moving mountain. Tommy's job was to monitor the plastic flow. Glaciers are not static, they are slow-moving rivers of ice. Within months, he noticed the terrifying truth. The walls were closing in. "The ice is alive, Silas," Tommy warned during a late-night briefing. "The pressure from the top is crushing the tunnels. We have to trim the walls every single day just to keep the doors from jamming shut." But the Pentagon was obsessed. The iceworm was the ultimate stealth weapon. They ignored the warnings, sending more men and more equipment into the deep freeze. Tommy watched as the nuclear reactor's foundations began to tilt. The ice was shifting, and the city of the future was being slowly swallowed by the earth. The silent retreat. By 1963, the dream was collapsing. The tunnels were warping so fast that the railway tracks for the missiles snapped like toothpicks. The army realized that you could fight the Russians, but you couldn't fight the physics of a glacier. "We're pulling out," Vance finally admitted, his face haggard. "The reactor is being pulled, but we're leaving the infrastructure. The ice will bury it forever." "In 10 years, no one will even know we were here." "What about the waste?" Tommy asked, looking at the lead-lined vats of radioactive coolant and the thousands of gallons of diesel fuel left in the pits. "The ice will keep it frozen forever," Vance said confidently. "It's the safest graveyard in the world." The thaw. For 50 years, Project Iceworm remained a secret. The soldiers went home, the tunnels collapsed, and the snow covered the entrance hatches. Camp Century became a ghost story. But in the 21st century, the world began to warm. In 2016, a group of scientists realized a terrifying reality. The Greenland ice sheet was melting faster than anyone predicted. The graveyard wasn't permanent. The radioactive waste, the PCBs, and the chemical sludge left behind by Project Iceworm are now slowly migrating toward the ocean. Tommy Reed, now an old man living in a quiet suburb, watches the news reports about the melting Arctic. He remembers the hum of the nuclear reactor and the sight of the tunnels glowing blue in the dark. The secret the U.S. buried in the ice is coming back to the surface. The city under the ice was never meant to be found, but the Earth has a way of revealing the shadows we try to hide. The diplomatic earthquake. For decades, the United States and Denmark shared a comfortable silence regarding Greenland.
To the Danish public, Camp Century was a triumph of American-Danish cooperation, a scientific city under the ice. But in 1995, a Danish historian digging through declassified U.S. archives stumbled upon the ice worm blueprints. The revelation hit Copenhagen like a seismic shock. The Danish government had a strict policy against nuclear weapons on their territory. Learning that the U.S. had planned to turn their snowy protectorate into a massive nuclear launch pad without their permission sparked a national crisis. "They used us as a shield," the headline screamed. The ice worm scandal forced a complete reevaluation of the U.S.-Danish defense treaties. But while the politicians argued in carpeted rooms, a much more physical problem was brewing beneath the ice. The ghost in the permafrost. Deep within the shifting layers of the Greenland ice sheet, the physical remains of Project Iceworm were undergoing a grotesque transformation. As the glacier flowed, it didn't just move the base, it tore it apart in slow motion. Steel beams that once held a cinema were twisted into metal knots. The wooden barracks were crushed into splinters. But the most dangerous part remained intact, the sump pits. During the base's operation, thousands of gallons of sewage, diesel fuel, and radioactive coolant from the PM-2A reactor were simply poured into unlined holes in the ice. The logic of 1960 was simple. The cold will keep it there forever. In 2014, a team of glaciologists led by Dr. Liam Sterling flew to the coordinates of the old base. They weren't looking for history. They were looking for a ticking bomb. "The radar is picking up something massive," Liam shouted over the wind. He pointed to a screen showing a heat-sensitive map. "The meltwater from the surface is trickling down. It's hitting the old waste pits and creating a toxic slurry." As the ice melted from both the top due to rising temperatures and the bottom due to geothermal pressure, the safe graveyard was turning into a subterranean river of poison. The awakening. Liam's team used a thermal drill to drop a camera into one of the abandoned ventilation shafts. The footage was haunting. The camera descended into a cathedral of blue ice. Suddenly, the light hit a rusted metal sign hanging crookedly from a frozen wall. "Welcome to Camp Century, the city of tomorrow." Below the sign, the camera captured a dark, oily liquid bubbling through a crack in the ice. It was PCB-laden transformer oil mixed with decades of chemical waste. "If this reaches the coast," Liam whispered, watching the monitor, "it will destroy the fishing grounds of the Inuit people. It will enter the food chain of the entire North Atlantic." The Americans had built a silent weapon to win the Cold War, but in their arrogance, they had created a slow-motion disaster that would strike long after the Soviet Union was gone. The debt of history. The story of Project Iceworm shifted from a military secret to a global environmental emergency. The U.S. Pentagon, now faced with the data from scientists like Liam, had to confront a difficult question. Who is responsible for cleaning up a city buried under 100 feet of ice? International law was silent on ghost bases. To dig it out would cost billions and potentially accelerate the melting. To leave it was to wait for the poison to arrive. Back in the U.S., the last surviving engineers of the project, men like Tommy Reed, were called to testify in closed-door hearings. "We thought we were heroes," Tommy told a panel of senators. "We thought we were outsmarting the enemy. We never thought about the ice. We never thought the world would get warm enough to wake up the monsters we buried." The lesson of the iceworm. Today, Camp Century remains a forbidden zone. It is a monument to a time when humanity believed it could master any environment through nuclear power and sheer will. As the ice melts, the world watches the iceworm coordinates. It serves as a stark reminder for the USA audience and the world. History never stays buried. Whether it's a secret mission or a toxic spill, the past eventually finds its way to the surface. The city of tomorrow has become a warning for the future. The ice is moving, the secret is out, and the cleanup has only just begun.